All right, I'll get started, and I've already gotten a little bit of a presentation from Mohammed and Fouad. I'm Lukas. I'm from Sweden, so I'm quite a few hours off your time zone. And I'm a member of the Blue Fire Open Source Collective, and like the main project that we have is the Flame game engine, which is like the only game engine for Flutter, basically. There are some other small ones too, but we're the only one that is like actively developed. And yeah, today I'm just gonna give you a talk about how to use Flutter and Flame for building 2D cross-platform games. Yeah, so what is Flame? Some of you might have tried it before or heard of it at least, but it's like I said, it's the most popular game engine for Flutter. And the game is put inside of something that we call the game widget. So you can use the game widget anywhere in your Flutter tree if you don't want to have it on your root. You could like if you just want to make a game, then you can just put it in the run app and then game widget and your game. Oh, it's a lot of people joining now. I think it's like bling 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 bling. But you can also make use of like Flutter's very good system for building interfaces and stuff. So you can get both the good power of Flame for building the actual game and the logic there, and you can use Flutter for building the menu systems and everything around it. We have 6,000 stars on GitHub, like 2,300 commits, 500 forks, and almost 100 people have contributed over around 4 years to the engine. So it has quite some community around it. And we're going to release version 1.1 next week. We released the release candidate just like half an hour ago. So if you want to give us some feedback about what we're doing currently, you can check out the release candidate. So in Flame, you have, like I said earlier, the game widget is just like any Flutter widget. It lives inside of your widget tree. And you can have it on the root, and you can have it anywhere. Like maybe you just want to have a little game as the loading screen for your actual business app or something. You can do that. You can do whatever you want. And this is basically all you have to write to like start creating boilerplate code of your game. You just extend the Flame game, and then you implement the onload method, where you load all the assets that you want to show during the game, and you create components. And components are, if you can draw a parallel to how in Flutter there are widgets, and in Flame we have components. And the components, they also have like their own tree inside of Flame. Because widgets, they're not very optimized to do game logic with them, because you kind of want to move from one state to another, and you don't want to re-render the whole game all the time, or the whole app that you have written in Flutter. But in Flame, you always re-render it all the time with like at least 60 frames per second, or 120 if your device supports that. So here is, if you don't want to use any other Flutter widget, then you can just do run app and your game widget and put your game in there, and boom, you have your game running. Of course, if you haven't like implemented anything in your game, it will just be a black screen, but it's the start. So in Flame, as I said, everything is a component. Even like the game itself is a component. And components can be composed of other components. So if I would want to, you could, for example, put this game as a child of another component. Or you can have, say that this component is your player, and you want to give your player a weapon or something. Then you just add another component to it, and it will, the player will walk around with that component, and all the transformations will be aligned to its parent. So that is something that we call FCS, which is Flame Component System. If anyone have done game development before, you might have heard about ECS, which is called Entity Component System, which is a bit more complicated to get into, but it's also a powerful system that I will talk a bit more about later. Right, and then a very common question for Flame is, how do I put a Flutter widget inside of Flame? And you can't really put it inside of Flame. You can only put it on top of Flame. And you put it on top of Flame with something called the Overlays API, which is basically a Flutter stack where you have the game widget in the bottom, and then you can put other things on top, like navigation and such. And in Flame, we implement something called a game loop. If anyone have done game development before, you are probably familiar with the concept, but for the ones that haven't, a game loop is basically two methods. One that updates all the logic in your game, and one that renders the results of that update. So you run your update method, and you see the little argument that we get here, double DT. DT stands for delta time, and that is the time that it has taken since the last update. Because if you don't take this into consideration, if you, for example, have a slower device, then your game will be easier to play because your enemies will move slower and things like that. So after you've done all the update logic, it can be like moving around your player and, I don't know, putting in more coins or enemies or whatever. Then you want to render that, and then after the render is done, the update is called again, and then it goes like that in an infinite loop. And this is called 60 times per second at least, to be able to get like smooth animations and such. So this is what a component would look like. And you can see here that the components also has the update and render loop. So that means that you can like take out, you don't have to have all your logic at the same place. So if you have a player component, for example, and you can have all the logic that relates to your player inside of that component. And then in your Flame game, you can have the more like overarching logic of the game, so that you don't get just one file with like super much logic in it. It will be very hard and probably very bug prone. And you also have the render method here if you want to do some special rendering things. So this is component is the like most basic building block, but in Flame there are already a lot of components. Oh yeah, and here you can see how you can just, if you have another component that you want to add a component to, you can just say add and this component, which will make you able to build this component tree that we were looking at earlier. And you don't have to add it in on load, you can add it anywhere. So you can add it like, if you tap something, you want to add a new hat to your player, or yeah, whatever. You can react to other things than just it being loaded. And a quite common mistake that people do is that when they have a child component, instead of adding it to the parent, they call the updates and the render method manually. But if you do that, you will lose out on all of the features that the game engine is providing for you. So you should absolutely not do like this. That's why I'm only showing this slide for a few seconds so that you don't memorize it wrongly. So instead of doing this, you do just add the component, and update and render will be called automatically. And you won't have to care more about that. So the most common component that we have in Flame is called position component, and that represents all components that can have a position on the screen. And it can have a size, and it can have it can be scaled up, and it can have an angle. And so all your enemies and your players and things, they will all be position components. But if you have components that aren't visible, for example, then they won't be position components, like a timer component, for example, that is just doing things in the background and don't have to show anything. And this is a bit of a simplified I don't know if you have seen about the vector2 class, but it's basically just contains a x and a y in it. So you can say position.x, position.y, or size.x and y. And we have an implementation of this called notifying vector, which makes it possible to listen to the position, size, and scale of other components. So if another component moves or so, you can have your other component react to that movement. And it's all backed by a transformer matrix. So these are some of the common position components. So we have component in the bottom, and then position component is built on top of that. And on top of position component, we have like the sprite component, for example. And a sprite is basically an image. It's basically the name for an image, but in the game dev terms. And then we have the sprite animation component. So that's basically just an animation that can be composed in different ways. And we have a parallax component, which, if you don't know what the parallax is, it's several layers of backgrounds. So if you imagine sitting on a train, for example, the things that are closer to you, they're moving much faster than the things that are further away. So if you add a parallax component to your game, you can get a sense of depth in your game, even though it's only 2D. And we have simple things like text components and shape components if you want to just do geometrical shapes in your game, and a lot more. You can check out our docs later and you will see that there's a lot of components in here. So here's an example of a sprite component. It's just this like pixel art person player thing or whatever it is. And sometimes you want to use that, but most of the time you want something moving. If it's not like, if it's a stone or an obstacle in your game, then maybe you want to use a sprite component because it should be static. So then we have the sprite animation component, and here you can see how the sprite is like breathing or whatever it does. And that's also very useful. And then we have, this component has a very long name, but we thought that it's better to have it descriptive than to shorten it up. And it's called Sprite Animation Group Component. And as you can see here, it is like just standing there and breathing when I'm not doing anything. But when I'm clicking on it, then it starts walking. So you can shift the state of the Sprite Animation Group component to what it's doing. So you put in several animations in there, and you can say, now I want this Sprite Animation Group component to run, or I want it to stand still, or I want it to do a jump animation. So that is very useful. And of course, as any game, you need to be able to take in input from the user. And you can use all of the different detectors that Flutter is providing. But we have added them as game mixins, so you can directly react to them on the game without having to add widgets outside of the game widget. So here you can see, like, yeah, you're probably familiar with these ones, like tap and secondary tap and double tap and long press and multi-touch tap detector. It's like if you have several fingers on the screen and you want to do something, or multi-touch drag, we have several fingers and they drag around the screen if you're doing something crazy, and a lot of other things like that. And some of these are only useful on certain platforms. So for example, multi-touch, the multi-touch detectors, they're not very useful if you're running desktop or web because you usually only have one mouse to react with. And the same with like mouse movement detector, you only have a mouse on a desktop and web, but you don't have it on your phone. And it's a long list here. And then we also have input that the components can react directly to. So if you build your component, you can just add a mixin to say that, okay, this component should be able to react to taps. And then it reacts to taps that are on top of that component. And then you can just implement these methods to see what logic you want to do when that event is happening. And same with draggable, then it reacts to drags on top of your component. So you can drag it around, for example, or I don't know, like fling it away if it's some game like that. and hoverable if you're doing a web or a desktop version. Then it's useful to react to hoovers. And in Flame, we have something called bridge packages, so we have the Flame core here in the middle, and around that we have a big mono repository with a lot of other packages that connect Flame to other types of packages. For example, Forge 2D here is a physics engine that we have ported from Box 2D. So if you want to use a physics engine in your game, you just add Flame Forge 2D to your pubspec file, and then you will get components for that in your Flame game. And we have like audio players for if you want to play audio in your game, which you usually do. And Flame Fire Atlas, that's a tool for building sprite animations. It's pretty cool. And then we have Flame Oxygen, which is this system that I talked about earlier. It's Flame usually uses FCS, which is Flame Component System, but then we also have an ECS implementation, Entity Component System, and that is Oxygen. So if you want to use, if you want to have like, I don't know, 20,000 objects or something, then Oxygen might perform better than a Flame Component System. But it is much more earlier stages than Flame, so it doesn't have support for as many things. But nonetheless, very nice package. And we have a lot of other features, of course, like we have a camera and a viewport, so that you can move around the camera in your game. You can like follow components. Maybe you want to follow your player. Then, like imagine Super Mario, for example. Then the camera is always following Super Mario throughout the world or the level where he's in. And then a viewport if you want the game to be like the same aspect ratio on all devices, so that it doesn't get easier to play on like big screens, for example. You can also set fixed resolutions and stuff like that in the viewport. And we have collision detection, and that the collision detection that is built into Flame, that one just says when two things overlap, then it will then you have some methods of reacting to that collision. So say like, okay, now my player had a collision with this obstacle, and then you have to react to what you want to do. If you don't want to write this like reaction logic yourself, if you just want everything to be like static bodies that can bounce against each other, then you can use Forge 2D and it will handle everything like that for you. But the built-in collision detection system is a bit simpler to use, I would say, because Forge 2D is a very like other big thing that you have to learn, and usually the built-in collision detection system is enough for most people. And we have effects, so you can do really cool animations and stuff. If you want to say that you want to move your player with a certain curve, or like say that it jumps and you want the jump to be fast up and then like slowing down when it reaches its peak and then go down again, you can do that. Or you can have scale effects, so you can make it smaller or bigger, and you have like rotation effect, you have coloring effect and opacity effect, so you can make your game look pretty, basically. And gesture and input handling, like I said. Then we have built some layers on top of Flutter to make that simpler inside of Flame, since it is built a little bit differently than Flutter. And if you want to render a lot of images at the same time, we have implemented something called Sprite batching, which means that you don't have to do a lot of canvas renders all over again. You can tell the sprite batching thing that I want to render these 10,000 images, and then the sprite batching will like batch them together as a group and then render them all at the canvas at the same time, which makes it a lot more efficient. But you usually only have to use it in like extreme cases when you need to render a lot of things. And the physics engine, as I said, through Forge 2D. And we have a quite useful debug mode. So as always, when you're coding, you're doing and you get some problem, you want to like inspect that, and then you can set debug mode equals to true, either on the game or on your component. And if you set it on the game, then all of the components in the game will have the debug mode activated. And debug mode, it shows where the component is supposed to be drawn out. So it has like a little square around it, and it says what position it has and what size it has. And if it has any hitboxes or something like that, it will also draw them out. It helps a lot of when debugging your code. So I hope you're all excited for building Flame games now, and you might wonder, how do I get started with building Flame games? Every time we build a new feature, we put up, I love the comments here, we put up an example on examples.flameengine.org. So if you're, that's a very good place to like start to go and explore what different features Flame has. And like, it's not a very pretty site, because it's not really supposed to be. It just should have one example of each feature that we have, and then it has the code with it too. If you press up in the right corner, there is 2 angle brackets, and then you get directly to the code in GitHub for that example. So then you can reuse a lot of the code in the examples there to build your own game. And then of course we have documentations at docs.flameengine.org. And you can also find all these links if you just go to flameengine.org, and there will be a little navigation in the top where you can go to them. And we have a short tutorial that we're still working on, and that's tutorials.flameengine.org. It only has 2 chapters so far, but there are a lot of other great tutorials out there written by other community members, that, and you can find those tutorials on our Discord. There's a long list there. And when you get stuck with your Flame game, what can you do? We have a super nice community. It's a really nice feeling on our Discord, where most of us hang around, and where people talk about all kinds of things, not only Flame, but as soon as someone needs help, they ask there, and people reply and help them out. And if you're more comfortable with Stack Overflow and chatting, then you can just put the Flame tag, and you'll hopefully have a reply within a day or so. We're trying to keep that tag, everything answered on that tag. And if you find a bug in Flame, or if you think that you might have found a bug, or that you have a feature that you think that we're missing, then you can open a GitHub issue and describe thoroughly what it is that you think is a bug, or the feature that you want us to implement. And you can write about it there, and we will reply to you. Right, that was my presentation, but I'm gonna actually show you some of the examples from the page that I had there earlier. So I'm just gonna swap the presentation tab here, because these ones, let's see, yeah. So you probably won't get super good frame rates since I'm streaming over Meet, but if you go in here yourself, then you will be able to see the same thing. And you have all the examples here on the side that you can go through and look at. And if you find something that you want to see, like, how do I do this? Then you press these angle brackets up here where it says C code, and that will open up the GitHub page with the code for that example. And if you want to share the example with someone else, this is just the sharing button. And if you want to say, yeah, here was some other animation, but if you press this little phone here, then you can set it to, if you want to try it out how it would look like on a device, then you can put the frame on there and it will show it to you. Let's see, let's remove that one. Great, now I have forgotten how to actually remove the thing. Maybe I can just reload the page, much easier. So here you see some basic animations. And here is that animation that I was showing earlier with the sprite group component, where you can see how it's walking when you're pressing. And what else do we have? Something here we have with the camera and the viewport. So here you can see that there's a viewport that is a square. So it's only showing a square here, as big as it can get. And then you can like go around here. You can see how the camera is following it. And if you go onto these boxes, it will bring it up. We have like the collision detection system here, so you can see how they can detect when they intersect. Let's see. Yeah, so you can see how the collision detection system is working with many components at the same time. It's a lot of calculations going on there. And we can show some effects maybe. So you can see that you can do, like, there are a lot of different types of effects that you can do. And you can like sequence the effects too, if you want to. So here it's like moving, and then it's scaling it, and then it's moving back. Anything else that we should show here? I think here you can just look into yourself, and you will be able to. Yeah. So let's take some questions.
So we have few questions, Lucas, from Summer. Does force press detector depends on the device?
So that's actually a Flutter question, because it just takes that detector from Flutter. But yeah, I mean, it does depend on the device, because not all devices will support different forces. I mean, like if you use your mouse on your PC, it will not differentiate between a hard click and a soft click.
Great. So we have another question from Ariba. Is it possible to add tap functionality to both the game class itself and components? Tap detector and has trappable make sense? If yes, then what approach should be taken?
Yeah. So if you want to add like gestures onto your like components, then you want to use the mixins that are called tappable, draggable, and hoverable. And the other all of the other detectors, those ones you have to use on your game class, and then you can like propagate the events to your component if you want that.
Great. Okay, so we have another question from Fatma. How to make a game? Okay.
How do we make a game? Did you say that?
Yeah.
I would start with a tutorials page then, tutorials.flame-engine.org. Then and join our Discord too. People will be willing to help you there probably.
And yeah, another question is from Aliba. Is it possible to send variable values from Flame to the regular text widget?
Yes, so that's a very good point actually. There is another mixin called has game ref, which means that the component has a game reference. So you can inside of your component then you can just write game ref and then dot the variable that you want to access.
Okay, and another question is, does Flame support drive animation?
Yes, so as I talked about earlier, we have these bridge libraries, and we have a bridge library for drive actually, which is called flame_drive. So you can just add that to your Flame game, and you can get drive animations.
Yeah, so Anas is saying, maybe I wasn't here, but you have answered what's the potential of making games on this platform. I mean, there are a lot of other platforms like Unity and other.
Yeah. So Flame is so Unity, you know, is this huge game engine. It can take a little bit longer to get into, and it's not as nice to do cross-platform games on it. But Unity is absolutely more powerful than Flame, of course, because they have like hundreds of employees and we're 5 people making this. But we have one thing that they don't. We have Flutter, and Flutter is amazing for building all the things around it. So I would say that is the big upside of Flame, that you can build it in Flutter.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you on this. So Flutter has a lot of features that even the React don't have. So yeah, if you can make great games in mobile and Flutter, so I think why would you need Unity for that?
Yeah, so if you would want to make a 3D game, for example, then you definitely want to go for Unity or Unreal Engine or something like that.
Agree.
Because in Flutter they don't support something called shaders yet, or not fully. and they don't support something called a Z buffer, which makes it very hard to make 3D games efficiently on Flutter. But at some point, I think it's slowly coming to Flutter. So at some point there will be 3D, but right now it's quite hard to make 3D things. And thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun. Stay tuned for next week when we release the new version of Flame. It will be very nice, I think.